Welcome to Series 2 of my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. I'm Smita Tharoor. In Series 1, I had the great privilege of hearing stories of unconscious bias from some wonderful people about a wide range of topics. I laughed, cried, and was moved in equal measure. I started this series because I wanted the listeners to realize that we are not alone. All of us have similar stories. They may not be the exact same, but when we hear them, we can hear the parallels in our lives. My speakers have all shared their learning and how they manage their unconscious biases, which is also a wonderful life lesson for us. Series 2 will follow the same style of interview. I hope you enjoy listening. Hello everyone. I would like to introduce Rosemary Jane Cronin. Rosemary is an artist and university lecturer specialising in fine art, gender and psychoanalysis, an unusual combination, as I'm sure you would agree. She has exhibited and performed at the Freud Museum and the National Portrait Gallery in London. Her film Reverie was selected by the Guggenheim Foundation in 2016. As an educator, Rosemary works for the Outreach Department at University of Arts London and museums and galleries across London to help make art accessible for all. Welcome, Rosemary, and thank you for joining this conversation on Stories of Unconscious Bias.
Hi there, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Rosemary, as you and I have already discussed, we're planning to discuss unconscious bias. So when you hear these two words, what do you understand by the meaning of the words unconscious bias?
Well, as somebody who's into psychoanalysis, the conscious and the unconscious is always on my periphery. But unconscious bias, I guess for me, it means everything that you hold within you that surfaces when you don't expect it to, and the unknown that might appear, particularly in the way that you operate within society without even thinking.
Absolutely. And of course, you have the added advantage of having studied and understanding a subject like psychoanalysis that gives us all a much more informed opinion on the unconscious bias. I haven't studied psychoanalysis. I've studied psychology, which is not quite the same, but it has made me reflect and think a lot about what these two words mean to me. And as you probably know already, I grew up in India and then moved to London in my 20s. And growing up in India, my education was the fee-paying system, because just how it was in those days in India amongst a certain socioeconomic group of people. So I arrived in London, and when I had children, it didn't even occur to me that there were different modes of educating my children. I thought, obviously, and this was my obvious unconscious bias, obviously the best education has to be fee-paying. Good news in this story is that I have more than one child. And so by the time my second and third child were around and we were thinking about education, I had perhaps grown up a little bit more in terms of my own unconscious biases. And my youngest went to a school in an inner city comprehensive school in Battersea, new friends, made friends from so many different communities and countries, and had a completely different experience to my eldest, who went to a fee-paying school all his life. So it certainly taught me one aspect of how my upbringing made me assume one was the right way, when of course I'm not suggesting one is right and one is not right, but I wasn't allowing myself to think beyond that. So when you're hearing stories like that, Rosemary, what kind of stories can you share with us?
Yeah, I guess in the education realm, I'm really fortunate that part of my role at University of the Arts London is that I visit schools and colleges across London. And I'll never forget my first day in my role, where I came out of a station quite in far east London, and went through quite a way to get to the college. And this area of East London is particularly deprived even after the Olympics. It still hasn't regenerated, which may be good. Maybe good that it hasn't had that horrible regenerated feel to it and had that kind of social cleansing. But at the same time, the school or the college actually I know that they've really struggled with their funding. But anyway, what I met on that first day was a group of young people who didn't think it was possible to be an artist or designer. And just through an hour talking with them, we really managed to get to a point where they felt that they could be part of the arts. So I previously have worked on programs working with young homeless people, young refugees, and giving them different creative methods that help build them a portfolio, but also give them an escape, a place where they can make and create that takes them beyond anything that they're experiencing in life at the moment. And my real drive for that is my dad, I think. So my dad was one of seven, and he was born in 1940s London, to a single parent family. To put it mildly, they were on the breadline, and my dad, bless him, had 4 jobs as well as school, so delivering papers, delivering groceries, and then doing odd jobs around his neighbourhood. And he was exceptionally bright, but because he was severely dyslexic and couldn't spell, he was chucked out of school at 11, and that was it. That was his education. But as I said, he was exceptionally bright, and he found an area that he loved, which was film. And he worked his way up from cutting adverts in cinemas and being a projectionist to editing live news to then owning a picture library, and now he, for his retirement projects, he runs a TV station. But he instilled within me the importance of education because he didn't have access to it. And he never pressured me, and he always encouraged me to follow what I loved. But his story and that idea of a lack and not having access and being told that he wasn't clever because he couldn't spell. I think I have something about the underdog inbuilt in me, and I want to support people that may not think that they can or have been told that they can't, and I really want them to bloody succeed.
Wow. I'm slightly bereft just hearing the story. I'm looking forward to meeting your father someday. Um, but he sounds like a remarkable man. He really does. But there are a couple of things I heard you saying in that story when I was listening. One certainly was what about your father and about his own inbuilt belief in what he wanted to do, and how he achieved what he did. And by doing that, and then bringing up his children, as in bringing you up and instilling education and the importance of education in you, it taught you 2 things. Because one was, of course, his unconscious bias was that education was important. He wasn't allowed that education, and therefore he'll make sure that his children have it. And so many of us listeners who might have children may recognize that in themselves. Oh, I always wanted to learn to play the piano as a child, and I never did. Guess what? I'm going to get my children to play it, kind of thing, uh, which is easily done because each of us want what we didn't have, and certainly your father was no exception in that. But then there was something else as well, because he was also imbibing in you certain values. Now, we often talk about unconscious bias and how we're impacted because of our upbringing. And of course, in your upbringing, your value system was very early on about be the person you want to be, and education is very important. And both of those things were extremely powerful. And of course, a third point that I took away from your very moving story was that your unconscious bias now, because you know your father's story, and you know how he, you know, really fought out there to achieve what he's achieved. And therefore, it's not a conscious bias, but to begin with, was probably an unconscious bias that you love the underdog and you want to support them, and you will do everything you can in your power to make sure that they will achieve perhaps what they didn't know they could achieve. So a kind of role reversal, like supporting your father. But of course, these young people are not your father. 3 amazing aspects to the stories that you've just shared with me, Rosemary. But let's just go back a little bit to the people that you are working with now, the students. And you mentioned refugees, for example, or people who have not had the opportunity, and the kind of belief or self-belief they have before they meet with you and how they change. Tell us a little bit more about that in terms of stories of their unconscious biases, or what you saw, anything, because all of this sounds amazing.
Oh, thank you, Smita. I think, yeah, I was really privileged, or maybe privileged, not the right word, but I was fortunate enough to work with Southwark European Social Fund, St Mary's project, and they honestly a tiny team of key workers who work with a huge amount of young people, and try and connect them with opportunities to get them started. And one of um, one of the projects I did with them was called the Domino project, and that was with the National Portrait Gallery. And I worked with a fantastic artist called Othello de Souza Hartley and another artist called Tom Moore. And we arrived at the centre, and we were introduced to a couple of young people who were all slightly timid and slightly reluctant to engage. But Othello, I think because he was um, he was a male character that they looked up to as younger men, they could relate to him in some way. And my role was kind of brokering the relationships between the organisations, but also just to support the creativity and the workshops. But there were two boys in particular that really stand out, and there was one who he had been sent over to the UK, and I can't quite remember where he was. Oh, Eritrea. It was Eritrea. He was sent over from Eritrea, and to cut a long story short, he was promised that an aunt would meet him, but the aunt never came, and he was living on the Old Kent Road, which, if you know it, it's one of the most miserable roads in London. It's pretty desolate, and even in the car parks, it's full of people trying to hustle for work. So you'll come out of the hardware store and someone will say, "Oh, have you got shelves? I could put them up for you. It'll only cost you 20 quid." You know, it's a tough world, the Old Kent Road, and there's lots of different charities that are positioned along there because there are lots of vulnerable communities around there. But this young person was an absolute beautiful soul, who had got to that point and was really lost but hopeful, but didn't know where to begin, and had completely lost a sense of their identity. They'd come to an unknown country and were completely flawed. So we used portraiture as a way for them to create an identity. I worked with the amazing Slam Ad Art team at the Maudsley Hospital, and a couple of their clinicians, Maslin and Simmons, have published a piece about the identity shift. And they talk about it in terms of people with addictions. But basically, for example, a lot of the young people that I work with, they just see themselves as that young person in a troubled state. But the minute they start engaging with something positive, so creative work, taking photographs, that's when they can have what is called clinically the identity shift. So they start to position themselves as an artist or as a photographer or as a writer. And that takes them away from what they perceive themselves to be in the past. And that's a real key thing that I have seen within people, but within all of us. We can all create these identity shifts, but it's about just taking that one positive step and having a reinforced positive loop to keep going.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm thinking about so many different examples that may not be anything to do with the kind of people that you have met. All of us will recreate, even very simply, having the identity shift of assuming that a private school education is the only one. It's that simple, because my identity was like that. But by making a conscious identity shift, I start thinking and seeing the world differently. And that's such a tiny, tiny, tiny thing. And so to be able to get somebody, this young Eritrean boy, to not see himself as just this lost Eritrean boy who's in a foreign country and doesn't know what to do, but this Eritrean boy who can work within the arts, and whether it's writing or photography or anything it might be. But I am good at what I do. I am creative, and that automatically affects our own uh, self-limiting beliefs and unconscious biases towards how we manage things. The fact that you're doing psychoanalysis and art must be extremely useful and advantageous in how you communicate and work with all these young people. Is it always young people, Rosemary, or you work across the board?
And no, I work across the board, but my specialist area is young people. And I don't know, going back to that conversation that we had about my dad and how we often work with audiences or work in some areas to fulfill that lack or that wish. And there's a great Carl Jung quote, which is, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents.
Please say that again. Please, for the listeners to hear it. Could you say it one more time, please?
Sure. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents.
And that is so much the classic explanation for unconscious biases in so many of us around the world. All of us are the products of our parents, and all of us know that. But how many of us reflect? I'm not suggesting that we've all been brought up well or been brought up badly. We all have bits of everything. When we become adults, are we able to self-reflect and to look back on our childhood rather than just assume this was all bad, and we will, without realizing it, we continue in the same mode of behavior, or perhaps cut away completely and don't see the good stuff that we had in our upbringing. But we all know that we are so much the product of our parents. So it's a brilliant quote that you've shared with us. So thank you for that, Rosemary. Give us some more stories. Give us another story, anything, either amongst your students or perhaps I don't know, anything you like, because I know you're full of amazing stories.
Well, just on a personal level, so as a child, I was always into dancing and the arts and writing, and I remember being told that a lot of my kind of thought process and the way that well, it wasn't how I was told, it was how my parents were told at parents' evening, was that I kind of just went off into my own world. And I went to a school where it was very kind of straight down the line, and it was a sports specialist school, and it was an all girls school, and a lot of the girls have gone on to being kind of I guess like lawyers and doctors. So the arts wasn't that supported, and I was told from the age of 7, she's not very academic. And this has kind of been like a loop in my head. She's not very academic. She's not very academic. And it's just quite mad now that I've got to working in academia that I've thought, maybe I am. There's this inner child, inner thought that says, maybe I am an academic. Maybe I can do this. But because for so much of my life I was told I couldn't, I had to get over my own unconscious bias of myself. And I think that is something that we all kind of navigate, and it takes different loops and different journeys before we can escape that.
That's so true. And again, I'm sure when listeners are hearing this, they're thinking about something that has been said and repeated to them about anything. It could be their physical appearance. It could be your intelligence. It could be your physical ability. Often with boys, they often say, "Oh, you're totally useless at football. There's no point you joining the team," or anything, any kind of comment, negative comment or opinion or judgment on another child when they are children. And of course, the children have no idea how to navigate that. And if you hear it for years and years and years, and often you might even hear it in your own home, then how do you overcome that? You fortunately did not hear it in your home. You heard it, in the school. But your parents believed in you, and your father specifically wanted you to go up there and soar and fly. And of course, you've proven to them that you can do it. And my God, you can do it because you're an academic and you're a professor at a university. So So there you are, the teachers who said that Rosemary cannot and will not be an academic student. But no, but seriously though, it is so powerful, and it's in so many ways. I mean, I'm at the moment, as you know, in lockdown Delhi. I might as well bring that
Mm,
into our podcast. And I
mm,
often think when growing up as a child, where color of skin seemed to make a difference. And not in my family, but certainly in other families, if you had three children and one was slightly lighter than the other, they were supposedly the pretty one. Also, if they were girls. And there are
mm.
so many comments that you grow up believing makes you feel lesser about yourself. So I'm very grateful that you were able to share that personal story with us, Rosemary. I know that we can talk and talk because you have so many other stories to share. But one last gem from your learning before we go for takeaways of learning. One last story that you would like to share with
Yeah.
us would be great.
Well, actually, one thing that was really pivotal, and it was during my teenagehood. Um, I I felt that, so I was from outside of London, kind of Greater London, where not much happens at all, and um, I was part of arts projects that were kind of DIY, so young people around Watford would do them together. Um, and then I just managed to stumble upon Tate had this youth collective, and Tate Modern had just opened, and they were looking for young people to be part of this peer group. And it really was quite a life-changing moment, because for me, it was about being part of a collective of people, and it didn't matter where they were from. And thank goodness I was blessed that that group were from everywhere, from all sorts of backgrounds, people from, just all different areas and different levels and stages of their life, even though we were similar age groups. And we all came together with a shared love, and that was just contemporary art. And I think we were all chosen because we'd disclaimed on our application form that we were struggling with something in life. So with me, it was my mum had died when on my 12th birthday, and I'd been quite I'd been brought up in a single parent family, and by my sister, and suddenly this was a new safe space, a new network that I could be a part of, and something that Esther Sayers, the woman who ran it, really inbuilt into us was this idea that art is accessible for all. And she worked with people across different organisations and groups to share the love of the Tate collection and contemporary art. And when my work was selected for in 2016 for the Under the Same Sun exhibition, that was a sentiment that was echoed with Esther, was that we're all under the same sun. And that is maybe how I shift my unconscious bias. So if I start to have a thought about something or someone, there is this feeling that we are all under the same sun. And in the midst of this global pandemic, we're really feeling it. And we're really feeling how people are, politicians and different countries and groups are navigating that idea of dealing with something and how we're coping with our society and our communities. But yeah, something that I wanted to share was the idea that we are all under the same sun, and if we carry that with us, I think it is a mantra that how I work with people, and how that we should all have access to the same things and the same sun rays.
Rosemary, I feel privileged to have had this conversation with you. Thank you so very much for giving us your insights, your honesty, and your wisdom in telling us about and teaching us about unconscious bias. Thank you so very much, Rosemary.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you post lockdown.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. If you enjoyed hearing this episode, do tune in every Saturday for a new interview. And if you could share, leave a review and rating, that would be hugely appreciated. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter @Smita Tharoor, and feel free to suggest new guests. Until next week.